because we have lots of long routes through forests, across farmland, and those routes of infrastructure can have environmental impacts, and they pass lots of people's houses, they pass near buildings, and then they actually go into cities as well. So it's actually what I'm going to talk about today might be, hopefully, will be very relevant for your career designing, installing pipelines. So this is normally Sue Hale's lecture. Sue sends her apologies. Sadly, Sue's ill at the moment. Have you met Sue Hale before?
Yes.
You have, yes. Yeah. Did she give? Does anybody remember what that lecture covered? Environment.
Society.
Sustainability was great. So that lecture was quite high level. It was about the terms and definitions. Things like terms and definitions like the precautionary principle, for example, that a lot of EU legislation is based on the precautionary principle, that if there is a potential environmental problem, like climate change, but the science is not 100% certain, but the problem is potentially very severe, the precautionary principle would say that we should take action as a precautionary measure, even if we're not fully aware of all of the scientific issues. This particular lecture is much more operational. It's much more about the tools that you might use to help to manage the environmental impact of a company on a day-to-day basis. The other question that I wanted to ask you is, this lecture is about environmental management systems. You're pipeline people, and have you had a lecture on environmental impact assessment, EIA? You have. So, does that ring a bell, EIA, environmental impact assessment? Yes. For some of you it does. So, can anybody tell me the difference between an environmental impact assessment, an EIA, and an environmental management system? When do you use an EIA? At what stage in the process? At the start. Yeah, 10 points, this team. Yeah. So you use an environmental impact assessment at the start of a new project, at the design stage, and then it follows through to a construction stage. So when do you think we use an environmental management system? Yeah, operational phase, an operational phase. Excellent. So this is where we are today. We're focusing more about the day-to-day operations of the pipeline company. So how do we maintain? How do we inspect the pipelines? How do we maintain the pipelines? Travelling, dealing with leaks, oil leaks, gas leaks, dealing with the community on an ongoing basis when they have complaints or issues. This is really the main focus of the environmental management system, and it's the main focus of my job. Having said that, it is also important to realise that many companies will have both. So they'll have an environmental management system, and they will identify in their environmental management system all of the environmental impacts of their organisation, and they will include construction impacts. But when they actually do a big construction project, then they'll do a more detailed survey. So if you could think of it like sets. Is there a pen? I bet there's no pen. Okay, there's no pen. But if you can imagine it like sets, you know, in maths you have sets. So the environmental management system is the whole set. Within that, environmental impact assessment is a subset. Okay. Right. Are you all on the pipeline course, or any of you on a different course? Not pipelines. You're all pipelines. Everybody's pipelines. Okay, excellent. Good, good. Would you like to just we're going to be here for 2 hours together. Would you like to quickly just introduce yourselves to me. Tell me your name and where you're from. Yeah. So.
My name is Matthew. I'm from India.
India. Welcome.
Jinyu from Singapore.
Richard.
From Uganda. I went to Uganda last year on a safari. It was a fantastic experience.
I've been telling them that.
You have a beautiful country. Yeah.
So would you recommend us to visit?
Absolutely. 10 out of 10.
Okay.
Yeah.
My name is Angel. I'm from Mexico.
Mexico. Okay, I've been to Mexico as well, to the Yucatan,
You can, yeah.
and that was very beautiful.
Not as beautiful as you guys.
It had a coral reef though.
A what?
Coral reef.
Yeah.
Coral reef.
Coral reef.
Yeah.
Coral reef, yeah.
Which was very beautiful.
Yes.
There was no coral reef in Uganda.
Can't compare with the Caribbean.
My name is Dauren, I'm from Kazakhstan.
Kazakhstan, welcome. Okay.
From South Korea, this is Janaki.
Okay, welcome.
My name is Angga from Indonesia.
Indonesia. Okay, good.
My name is Michael Weteka. I'm from Uganda.
From Uganda as well, so excellent. Yeah.
Reza from Indonesia.
Indonesia, okay, welcome.
My name is Imran, I'm from India.
India, okay, excellent. And yes. From Nigeria. My sister lives in Nigeria. Really? She lives in Jos. Very cold, about 20 degrees. So I've visited her once. Very, very enjoyable trip. Yeah.
My name is Martin.
South Korea. Okay, welcome.
Kazakhstan.
Kazakhstan. Excellent.
Mandy, I'm from China.
China, welcome.
Jay from South Korea.
South Korea.
Javier from Chechnya.
From
Chechnya.
Chechnya.
Yeah.
Okay, welcome.
My name is Kim Seo-won
Yeah.
from South Korea.
South Korea as well. Yeah.
I'm Ayo.
You're from Nigeria as well. Yeah. Not Jos.
No.
Not Jos. Okay. Right. Okay. What a fantastic group from all over the world. I love this. It's really exciting. So, I'm going to just give you a bit of an introduction to myself, and then we're going to move into the topic. So, this is me. My name is Marek Bidwell, Marek Bidwell. As I said, I did the MSc in Clean Technology here. I worked for Northern Electric. I then worked for an environmental consultancy where, having studied environment, I then also started doing health and safety and quality. What you find when you're working in industry is that very often the one person looks after health and safety and environment, and two sort of go together like this. So I do both in my job. The main activities I'm involved with are training, like this, auditing, so to do inspections, to look for environmental problems, and also give people advice, consultancy advice. I'm self-employed, I work for myself, but I work for a wide range of different sectors. So construction companies, quarries, factories, and even I've worked for banks and more office-type organisations. I'm very involved with my professional institute, the Institute of Environmental Management and Assessment. They were set up in the UK, but they're actually global in nature, and they're one of the main institutes for professional environmental managers. So if you're interested in this area, then check them out. I also run a book club called Green Thinkers. So think of the best tutor group you've ever had. We read books on hot topics of the day, like nuclear power, genetically modified food, fair trade, and then me and my friends, we discuss it in the pub for a couple of hours, and that helps to keep my knowledge up to date since I left university. And you can check that out as well, because we write about the discussions that we have. Okay, so my first job then was for Northern Electric, now called Northern Power Grid. And I'm going to start by describing to you, after I finished my MSc course here in environmental management, my first job. Okay. So my first job was working for this company that have operations from Newcastle all the way down to Leeds and up to the Scottish borders. So physically a really big geographical footprint. They distribute the electricity through overhead pylons and underground cables. And it was my job. I was the very first environmental manager that they employed. Okay. They'd never considered the environmental impact of their activities before, but they were getting pressure from the government to do something. So I finished my degree course, and then here I was working for this big company with all these very senior engineers, and I was like the student, and I had to find out what they did, because I'm not an engineer, I'm a biologist and a geography student. And then I had to work out what the environmental problems were and then help them solve them. So it's a really interesting profession, because you have to know about engineering, you have to know about chemistry, biology, geography, and you have to know about psychology. Because if you want to make anything happen, the most important thing at the end of the day is people. So it's a very good career for somebody that is interested in lots of different subjects. So what do you think the environmental issues are here? So?
The river.
Yeah, the river. Okay, so is there any potential problems with the river, with pylon? Yeah, that's right. So big birds flying into the power lines, and then they cook. Then you can put them on your barbecue.
When they go in the river.
And they fall in the river. But seriously, in England, people love birds, love bird watching. I like bird watching. So this creates a lot of, if you like, complaints if the birds fly into the lines. Okay. Here's another picture, which is a team of engineers assembling a line across farmland. What issues do you think I might have to deal with here? Access. Yeah, good. Across the farm. And as you can see, there's some valuable crops in this area. So the farmers always put claims in for compensation when we damage the crops. So this is quite an important issue. And also permission. We have to try to keep on very good terms with the farmers that the lines go across. So for you as pipeline engineers, the same principle applies. To try to keep as good terms as possible with the land owners, because they can create all sorts of problems for you if you can't easily access. Because even if your pipeline goes here, to access it, you might need to do a different route. But if you don't have access, then that could be very difficult. So we spent a lot of time just simply talking to the farmers and also giving them money. But not too much money, because otherwise the money went up and up and up. But more seriously, trying to stick to defined, predetermined access and egress routes. So there was always a map with a red line on, and we had to try to tell the staff, we must go this way, not this way. Because this way might be, you know, a more sensitive area. Just going to try and... Oh, there we go. That's better. Yeah. Okay. So, in pipeline engineering, you have places where, like storage facilities, connections. In my job, we had substations. So this is where the electricity is transformed from one voltage to another. But all you need to think about with this photograph is what's the additional environmental impact. So do you think there's any potential risks here?
Perimeter.
Yeah, yeah. In fact, there's always a fence around it because there's equipment in here that's very valuable. In fact, it has copper in it, so thieves try to break in, steal the copper. But when they steal the copper, they have to smash the valves and let the oil flow out.
Is there any other impact on the environment, like electromagnetic fields or waves that might affect like insects?
Yeah, good point. So there's EMFs, electromagnetic fields, and there are World Health Organization guidelines about the distance that you should be from an overhead power line, because it can affect your brain. Yeah. That they should be limited to the time that they can spend in very close proximity to the high voltage power.
Regarding oil, you have the boundary.
Sorry?
You have the boundary.
Yeah, the boundary, the security fence. And then there's this concrete wall here. See this wall? Spill. Stop the spill. Stop the oil spill. This is very important because these things leak. In pipeline design, in pipeline engineering, do you have any oil that's used for storage or transformers?
What kind of oil inside this one? Is it like glycol?
It's just a mineral oil, low viscosity mineral oil. So it's actually not highly toxic when you put it in. People tell me when you put it in you could drink it and you'd be fine. The problem is after it's been in there for 20 years, it heats up. When it heats up, it breaks down. And it's the breakdown products that are more toxic than the clean oil. So then we have construction, somebody manoeuvring a transformer into place. Whenever you've got construction work, you've got additional risks. Like if we drop this, then we lose the oil. Transport issues. Not many people know but the high voltage, when you go into a city, the high voltage power lines go underground, not overhead. And in order to act as an electrical insulant, they're surrounded with oil. So basically what you've got here is an oil pipeline. And guess what happens to them? They leak. Yeah, they leak. And so we had a whole team of guys whose job it was to find the leaks, dig down, find the cable. You got to be very, very careful when you're digging because there's a risk of causing another leak or damaging some other surfaces. You see the soil here, heavily contaminated with oil. So in Britain, there's environmental laws basically which prohibit the discharge of oil into the environment. So essentially we're breaking the law here. So they have to dig it all out, put it in a skip, get it cleaned up, and then remediate the site.
Sorry, why do we have oil?
The oil is used as an insulant, electrical insulant, around the high voltage cable.
So you have pipe, you have inside cable, and you have oil.
Yeah. So you have a cable surrounded by a pipe, and in the oil. Yeah. And then we have vegetation management because we have to cut back the trees on either side of the lines to stop them shorting out. So there's environmental issues here, of course. Yeah, tree trimming. bird's nests, damaging people's property, and noise. So a really wide range of issues. So it's my job to identify those issues and then help to reduce the overall impact of the company on the environment. So what is an EMS? It's a management standard. The actual definition is, the notes will be on Blackboard, by the way. Part of an organisation's management system used to develop and implement its environmental policy and manage its environmental aspects. So two things to take away from that definition. The first thing is environmental policy, which has been written by the directors of the organisation. The environmental management system, for it to be successful, it has to be driven by the top management. They have to be engaged. Otherwise, you know, it's a bit like a football team where you've got the players saying they want to do one thing and the coach telling them to do another thing, and it just doesn't work. So it's got to come from the top. Okay, so think about if you've worked in an organisation before. If you put your hand up if you've worked for an engineering company or any company, a few of you. Now think about the managing director. Imagine that you are sitting down in the meeting with the managing director and you ask the managing director, are you concerned about the environmental impact of our activities? What are you doing to reduce that impact? What do you think the answer would be?
We have programs, sustainable environment.
Yeah. So it will vary. You know, it will vary from company to company. Some companies are very keen to have a good public image. Some other companies are less keen. But what I'd like to hope is that all of you in this room, you'll play your small part in making a difference in your career, because if you do your job well, if you design the pipeline well, if you make it robust, if it has monitoring devices on it, containment devices, then you can actually help your companies wherever in the world that you work. Okay. So it's not a product standard and it's not a performance standard. An environmental management system is a list of sensible things to do to improve the overall management of your company. It's a bit like a health and safety management system. So let's say this is your company, the oil and gas company. Something important about the environmental management system is it also considers the control and influence along the supply chain. So it considers your suppliers. Suppliers can be critical to safety and environmental performance in an oil and gas company. I don't have to think too hard for an example like Shell in the Gulf of Mexico, of where when the incident occurred, Shell said the platform is operated by a third party. BP, sorry, BP, yeah. Thank you, 10 points.
I'm from Shell.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Sorry. Forgive me. Sorry. So BP, right. So if they have, did BP have any control or influence over the company that are operating their platform in the Gulf of Mexico? Yeah, of course. They're paying them money to operate it. If you're paying somebody money for something, whether you're providing a product or providing a service, then you have some control or influence. So within an environmental management system, then also you have to consider the environmental impact of your suppliers. Also, you have to consider the environmental impact of your product or service. Now this is easier for some types of companies than others. For example, if you make washing machines, then you can influence the environmental impact of your washing machine in its use phase. You can design it to be more efficient, use less water, use less energy. So if you have the ability to influence the environmental impact of your product, then you should consider that. It's a bit difficult as a pipeline company because if your job is to supply oil or gas from A to B, you don't have a lot of control over the product because essentially you're in the middle, you're just doing the transport. So really what you could say is the environmental impact of the product is moving it from A to B as efficiently as possible. If you can do that, then you're winning. So ISO 14001 is a proactive, it's voluntary, there's no law that requires you to have it, an environmental management system. It seeks continual improvements and it's based upon a documented systems to control the day-to-day activities and requires an environmental policy and objectives. So having just briefly introduced my first job, what do you think the advantages are for a company? Think about the companies you know. What would be the benefit for them to implement an environmental management system?
Public image.
Good public image, yeah. You might want to write these down. Okay. These are important, okay. Good public image. Yeah. One at the back. Reduce the risk of a fine. Yeah, reduce the risk of a fine. Yeah. So that's 2. Public image. Reduce the risk of a fine.
Reduce environmental consequences.
Yeah, reduce the environmental impact. So it's worth doing for its own sake. And the reason it's worth reducing the environmental impact is because the environment provides services to people. Can anybody think of an example of a service that the environment provides to a community? Food. Yeah, food is the most obvious example. If the area is contaminated, then you can no longer grow the crops. So food, yeah. Water. Again, if the water's contaminated, you have to truck it in from elsewhere. That's going to cost money. Soil. Exactly. A soil is a really important resource. When you think of soil, don't just think of dirt. Think of pound sites. Good quality soil is worth money. And there's lots of places around the world where the soil's been contaminated or it's been washed away. So, for me, one of the most important jobs that I have as an environmental consultant is trying to explain to directors, politicians, that the environment in a good state is worth money. It's worth money for food, it's worth money for drinking water, and it's worth money for soil. Okay? So, the environment is actually providing us with what we need to live. If we take that away, we have to pay extra to replace it artificially. So, if we can put a value on those services that the environment provides, a monetary value, then actually we can help to protect it. Yeah? I'll give you one example, and this is pollination services. So many crops depend upon bees and flowers to pollinate them. Without the bees, we would lose a huge percentage of what we need to eat. But in many areas, because of construction activities and golf courses and all sorts of things, all of the scrub has been removed. So there's not enough bees. So in California, where they grow almond trees, the farmers have to pay commercial companies to bring the bees in a lorry. Yeah, to pollinate the trees. they let the bees out, hand over the cash, then on to the next. So basically you're having to pay for something that nature should provide for free. So there's lots of examples, and of course there's another one as well, which is clean air. Clean air, because if we have clean air, we're more healthy and more productive. There's been a lot on the news recently about air quality problems, and all of these problems, it's not just the green environmentalists, you know, like going stop, stop, stop. It's not just them, it's the doctors. You know, the doctors are on the news saying this child has breathing problems, and it's costing the government money to treat them. So yes, so there's worth doing it because it protects the environment. Okay, good. So there's a slide here with some advantages of an environmental management system.
But sorry,
Yeah.
if on the other hand there is a problem of the average age of the people is growing, so it's a problem for the government.
Yeah.
I mean, paying the pensions,
Yeah.
the other things. There is some balancing.
Kill the wall.
Okay. So
How
why
you want to,
yeah.
how to say, motivate the government people? They have one, on the other hand, they have one problem.
Yeah, yeah.
And there is another problem. So
Okay, so what you want to do is maximize the productivity of the people. But if they're
average age should be decreasing because of money.
but that's only good if they're healthy. If they're not healthy, then they can't work. So if they're eating toxic food and breathing toxic air, then you've just got lots of unhealthy people, and that's not good for the economy. So in your world, you want really clean environment, healthy people, and then when they get to the age of 65, shoot them. Is that what you're saying? Yeah. Okay. That's your view, not mine. Yeah, so cost savings. This is another important one. There's lots of companies I've worked with when I've gone and done studies. I've looked at their lighting, heating, and I've found that they're just wasting money on energy, and sometimes waste. A good example for waste is a skip full of metal. It's got copper in it. The copper's worth £2,000 a tonne. The steel is worth £200 a tonne. But it's all in the same skip. And the waste company is only paying them £200 a tonne. If they segregate the waste into the more valuable waste and the less valuable waste, they can make a lot more money. And you might think, well, why don't they do this anyway? And it's because nobody's got time. Everybody's busy. So if you have an environmental management system, it forces you to focus on the waste. And if you can reduce the waste, you can save money. There are various international and national standards which companies can work towards, which demonstrate to the public and their shareholders that they have a certain level of environmental management. The most common one is this one, ISO 14001. For those of you that used to work for a company, do any of you know if your company had this standard ISO? Yeah, ISO 14001. Good.
They also had 9001
for quality. Yeah.
Which one is 18,000?
That's for health and safety. Yeah. So they're very, very similar. Everything that you're going to learn today about 14001, you can apply to 9001 and 18001. And in fact, the International Standards Organization recently restructured these standards to make the chapter headings exactly the same, which is great because I'm getting older and I can't remember lots of different numbers. So now I've just got one set of numbers to remember. There's also a European version of this standard called EMAS, the Eco Management and Audit Scheme. It's very similar to ISO 14001 because it has one additional requirement, and that's to produce an environmental report known as an EMAS statement. And in that report you have to, you can say all the good things you're doing, but you also have to say all the bad things you're doing. So there's a lot of companies that don't want to do this, so it's not very popular because you have to produce the report. And there's a British standard, BS8555, known as ACORN, which is very similar, but it's aimed at small and medium-sized companies. Okay. So, before we go into the structure of ISO 14001, I'd like you to split into groups of 3 or 4. And I'd just like you to have a go at the first exercise on this sheet. I'm just going to give you 5 minutes, so very quick exercise. So split into teams, 3 or 4. Work into rank the following environmental issues from 1 to 12 for an oil and gas pipeline company. Okay, 5 minutes.
Just the first one.
Yeah, just the top one. Yeah.
I think deforestation is a very
Mediation. Yeah, because you don't really have just mediation. I think we're going to realize this issue. Radiation is the like radiation to water, like the nuclear we use it in inspection. Yes, it's so what's the number? Yeah, that's it is really okay, liquid. Usually it's nice the water. The water is the result. The result. So Like wait test the pipeline. It is but once it becomes kind just yes. So you worry about which one should be the point? Waste or so we want to put it before or after? Well, I think it's 6 of waste. I think it should be on 6. If I don't do it, if I consider the last one, I get a very if I don't have the land, I'm going to receive a very but if I don't dispose my waste, that should be the tree doesn't cost it. Which one is I would say climate change. Because they can also
Okay, I'll give you two more minutes. Okay.
We just categorize it
Okay, so I'm going to stop you there. So I think we've got 5 teams. So I'm going to ask each team what you put as your top 3. Okay, so perhaps we could start with this team in the back left-hand corner. Yeah. So what were your top 3?
So we start with 1, yeah?
Yeah.
First one for us is contaminated play.
Yeah.
Second one we need to see waste,
Yeah.
water, urban air quality.
Okay. Okay. And for the
pollution.
so just the top three then to start with. So for contaminated land, why did you say contaminated land was the most important?
Because oil and gas company is the most important one because you consider actually there is four type of land, water,
Yeah.
waste, and air
Yeah.
quality.
Yeah.
They are more considered
Okay.
the oil and gas industry because other is by default.
Yeah.
And you have, for example, leaks. You have emergency situations, so consider it's going to be important.
Yeah. Okay. Any other reasons why contaminated land is a particularly severe problem? Yeah, the cost of. So it can be very, very expensive to remediate.
And the recommendation of the government, for example.
Yeah. It can also.
Actually, the most important one is like the reputation of somebody, so we will have to pay more for the reputation.
Yeah. Okay. So this team, in the back right hand corner, what were your top three? Yeah.
I was having a bit of a discussion about it because a lot of the options are very contextual. It depends on what way you look at them.
That's good. That's good. You can tell me about that.
We have some disagreement about it.
No, that's fine.
But essentially, water pollution, contaminated land, and deforestation.
Okay. So why did you put water pollution as very important? For what reasons?
Water pollution and contaminated land are both very similar.
Yeah.
You start having wholesale problems when you're operating in Dublin product into a water course.
Yeah.
It's going to cost you more money, public image. You can end up losing your operating license and not being a viable company anymore.
Okay, good. Thank you. Is it okay if we just have one conversation at once? Otherwise, it will be difficult for everybody to hear. Thank you. So, the team in the middle, this team, what did you put as your top three?
We put deforestation. Of course,
Yeah.
it depends on where you are located.
It does, yeah.
And then we thought of contaminated lands and then biodiversity. They are interrelated.
Yeah. Okay.
As we put deforestation for slope stability.
Mhm. Okay, so this team, deforestation, can you tell me why you put that as a top?
Based on where you are,
Yeah.
we imagine that you have a right of way, maybe at construction.
Yeah,
So that area will be free of forests. You have to have access to
yeah,
your pipeline. And in case of spillages,
yeah.
for the second one,
Would you mind if we just have one conversation at once? Thank you very much.
yeah, okay. For deforestation, it's access for operation, access for maintenance. So that will be depending on the area you are in. And then the other aspect was contamination, based on if say you had a leakage,
Yeah.
and those remediation costs associated with
Mhm.
restoration.
Okay.
And then since it was a little bit interrelated, there would be loss of biodiversity
Yeah.
in those locations. So those were like our basic three.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. Now, you also mentioned about engineering issues to do with the forest or potential deforestation. Can you elaborate on that a bit more?
Yeah, if you're put a corridor into a forest, you're going to go in along the rest of it. You're going to start getting movement on the ground, wash up the smoke, but about losing life.
Thank you. And so this is a really interesting point. There's two ways that the environment, a company thinks about the environment. They can think about the impact that the company has on the environment in terms of pollution often. But you've just explained there can be the impact of the environment, often a changing environment or a degraded environment on the company's activities. Deforestation is a really good example of that because it will change the hydrology of the area. It could contribute to landslips. One of the companies I work with at the moment is Northern Rail, now called Northern, who operate the railway lines around the north of England. They found over the last 5 years they've had a lot more landslips. This is caused for two reasons. One is removal of trees, and the second is increased rainfall intensity in certain areas. So the environment's having an impact on their operations. Okay. So 1, 2, 3. This team, what did you put as your top 3 issues?
Well, our top 3 was, first place was for water pollution.
Yeah.
Second place was for loss of the biodiversity.
Yeah.
And the third one was for resource depletion.
Okay. Okay, so if we talk about biodiversity, why did you put biodiversity as very important?
Well, I think mainly because of, could be for the economical aspect, because every time you harm any species, you get a fine, and
Yeah.
it can be a huge fine.
Yeah.
And also in the biology, like in the environmental point of view, these there are endangered species
Yeah.
that after they extinct, you won't get them back. You won't recover them.
Indeed. Yeah, and just this morning we heard on the news that some people broke into a zoo in Europe. I can't remember if it was England or France. I think it might have been France. They shot was it France? They shot a white rhino, critically endangered species, and then used a chainsaw to saw off its horn. It was a very, very sad story. And one of the most endangered species in the world. So yeah, of course, as a pipeline company, especially when we're opening up a forest, it can leave it vulnerable then to people coming in to poach the animals. And I think that we should be aware of this. But there may also be things you can do to reduce the chances of that happening after you put the pipeline in. Does anybody know if any companies have ever, for example, after laying a pipeline through a forest, have then tried to sort of close the gaps and make it more difficult to access afterwards with poachers and things?
Yeah,
Covered. Yeah, maybe they cover them with struts. Thorny plants.
so
Okay. Okay, and last team, this team, what did you put as your top 3?
Resource depletion
Yeah.
and urban air quality.
Okay.
The third one is water pollution.
Okay, thank you. So you put resource depletion as top.
So,
Why did you put that one as important?
for considering the companies, oil and gas companies, like
Yeah.
for example, oil.
Is what, limited? Yeah. Yeah. So the definition, does anybody know what the classic definition of sustainable development is? Yeah, sustainable development.
To think about the future.
has to do with the future generations.
Yeah.
Like satisfying our needs without
Yeah.
putting in risk the future the generation ability to satisfy their own.
Yeah, exactly. So you could argue that if there's a limited supply of oil, well, oil is fantastic because it's essentially created a large part of the civilization that we have today. So it's been fantastic for prosperity. Then you could argue that we have a moral obligation to make sure that future generations have some of that available to them so that they can get some of that benefit as well. Or at least that we try to help transition to other sources of fuel for them if we use this amazing resource ourselves. So meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Yeah, so resource depletion. Okay, good. So that's had a nice little think about environmental issues there.
We're gonna have a small break.
Yes, would you like a break? Okay. Can it be very short? That's okay. 5 minutes. Okay. Yeah.
When you joined Northern
exercise.
Yeah.
was there an EMS already in place? The management policies in place. You told you were the first.
Yeah, they have nothing.
So you had started from the
They had a health and
scratch.
safety policy, not environmental policy. So I have to write it. And then get it signed off by the director.
Were they looking for like a safety officer, or did you go and talk to anyone?
The government. Basically. So it's really difficult to go with
Because I know my sometimes it's possible to come and you explain to them some of these things.
Mostly, I need to talk to
Realize that what some of these systems are
especially
He's a close friend.
sometimes they can save money. Sometimes they have to spend money as well. To make it better. So they can save money on energy.
I don't know because when I
So the best thing to do is to have the government is finding money for, this could be you. And, actually finding this
I wanted to Are you going to have a assignment? Is it? But there is an assignment you pass. There's a female. Lecture last year. Actually, I can check that. I don't know why they changed. No, it's now I have 50 modules. 60. Same. Show a picture. He is quite my mom. This is good with that because it's very linear.
Maybe you change it before we have to get shown
I just want to propose for the church to give good mark. But for the final production, what happened? Proposal is really I think everybody got that.
Okay, we're going to start again. Two minutes. 2 minutes. Okay. Yeah. So, the second part of this presentation, we're going to talk about the structure of an environmental management system that meets the requirements of ISO 14001. And it's based upon this illustration. And it's very simply, it's based upon the plan, do, check, act cycle. Plan, do, check, act. So you might want to write down plan, do, check, act. So you do, check, and then act, and improve here. What does this mean? There was a quality guru called Deming. Has anybody heard of Deming? Yeah, you're obviously a quality person. He was born in 1900 in America, and he was a mathematician. And he specialised in statistical process control, improving the performance of processes. After the Second World War, he went to work in Japan and helped the Japanese to build better cars. And he helped them to build better cars by helping them to analyse very systematically the quality of their manufacturing operations so they can reduce the error, reduce the defect rates. And his very simple model for doing this was plan, identify the parts of the process which are working and identify the parts of the process which aren't working. Where are you getting problems, non-conformities? And then plan an improvement measure to redesign part of the factory or part of the system. And then implement that change in a small way, and then check, monitor and measure. If you're, for example, redesigning a bearing, measure the dimensions to see if your new system is producing bearings which are in tighter tolerances, so you've got less defects. And then check, and then improve, and review and improve. If your pilot has improved, worked, then implement it across the whole factory, roll it out. Okay? And this very simple model, Plan, Do, Check, Act, is now used by the international standards organisations for all management standards, quality, safety and environment. In this lecture, we're going to focus on the first three clauses, context, leadership and planning, I'll briefly explain to you what the remaining clauses require. So I'll start by giving you an overview. At the planning stage, you have to identify the environmental aspects and impacts, as we call them, and determine which have a significant effect on the environment. So it's a bit like the exercise you did before, some kind of ranking of priorities, except with some specific terminology which you're going to learn about in a minute. You also have to identify what legislation is important and set environmental improvement objectives. At the doing stage, you basically then take the significant environmental issues and control them. And you control them in two main ways: through people, i.e. behaviour, making sure that all of your staff put the right waste in the right skip, turn the lights off, do all the testing and inspection that's required to reduce pollution, and also operational mechanisms. So this can be engineering controls, like automatic leak detectors. And it can also be procedural controls, like an emergency response procedure. What happens if there is a leak? What do we do? How do we clean it up? So mechanisms of control. Of really big importance is performance evaluation, identifying the key characteristics that tell you if your environmental management system is performing. So what can you measure? What could you report to the managing director on a monthly basis that would tell the managing director if the environmental performance of your oil and gas company was going in the right direction or going in the wrong direction? So it would be things like energy consumption, hazardous waste, emissions from vehicles. Sorry? Clearance? Or flaring, yeah, flaring. How much have we flared? And of course, how much leaks? Yeah. How much has leaked out of the pipes? So with a few simple numbers, if those numbers are based upon the truth, reality, you can actually see quite easily whether you're getting better. Another good one would be the number of complaints from the public. So, and how severe those complaints are. How many times you've appeared in the newspaper that week. Yeah. And then improvement, yeah. So what lessons can we learn from the planning, from the operation, from the checking in order to drive improvements in our business? Okay. So as I said, we're going to focus on the first three chapters, but these other chapters are also important. Now, in the last exercise, somebody said the context is important. Who said the context is important? I think it was somebody over here. Yeah. So well done. Because the first chapter, chapter 4, the first three chapters are like terms and definitions. And it says you need to understand the context of your organisation. So before you get into the detail of identifying all of the risks, first of all, take a step back, look at your organisation and think about what countries do we operate in. What are the environmental issues in those countries? You know, is it rainforests? Is it deserts? Is it drinking water? Is it soil? And think about the external issues that may affect the environmental outcomes. External issues. Have you heard of PESTEL? Political, economic, social, technological, legal, environmental. PESTEL analysis is something that's done by directors very often to think about what could affect their business strategy over the next 5 years. But these types of factors can also affect the environmental outcomes. Political, like Brexit in the UK, because we're leaving the European Union. Most of our environmental legislation is based upon European Union rules. So Brexit is a very important consideration now for a company, for environmental managers, because things are going to change. We don't know how they're going to change, but they definitely will change. Economic, things like exchange rates can be very important for the performance of the environmental management system, because how much have you got to invest? How profitable is your company? Social issues. If you take an issue like a sensitive issue, like fracking, there's been a lot of resistance against fracking in the UK, and lots of communities getting in the newspapers, on television, because they're very worried about the impact. So you've got to think about what the local community groups are concerned about. Technology. There might be new technology that helps you to improve your environmental performance. For example, new leak detection technologies. So this is where we can actually look for positives rather than negatives. The legal situation, if there's new legislation, that may be an issue for our environmental system, because we have to comply with the law. And environmental changes as well, like changing climate change, deforestation, that can affect our business. And then we need to think about internal issues. So earlier I asked you, if you sat down with your managing director and asked them, what are you doing to reduce our environmental risk? Okay. The answer would actually depend upon certain things. The values of the business, and the shareholders. So it might make a big difference if your company is owned by the government compared to on the stock exchange, private or public shareholders. It might inform the values of your business. The culture. That's important. When you're actually trying to get staff to work to certain rules, you may find that the culture in one company is, yes, I'll do exactly as you say. You just have to tell them once, and they do it immediately. I've never seen that, but I'm sure it exists somewhere. Or you might find the culture is very, you just have to keep telling to try to get people to follow the rules. The culture is very laid back. The level of knowledge is going to be important as well, these things. So context is an important issue. The next clause is leadership. And there's a number of requirements for top management in ISO 14001. The standard requires that top management demonstrate leadership and commitment to the environmental management system. I always use the illustration of a conductor, because I feel that top management should be, they don't have to do everything, they don't have to play every instrument, but they should be, setting the rhythm, coordinating what's going on. So really, in a nutshell, top management have to write the policy, set the objectives, but they also have to provide the resources, because sometimes you're going to save money, but other times you have to spend money. Communicate the benefits to the staff, direct and support people, and drive continual improvement. A key requirement for top management is to establish an environmental policy. The policy statement, to be compatible with ISO 14001, has to contain certain key requirements. We're not going to have time to do this now. We might like to do it for homework. On the back, I've reproduced the requirements for environmental policy from something. These types of things, the policy has to include commitment to pollution prevention, for example. And I just picked at random, just completely at random, I searched for like oil and gas company environmental policy. I don't know if you've ever heard of this one, Kinder Morgan. They're one of the biggest pipeline companies in America. This is their environmental policy. And so for homework, what you can do is to read through the requirements of ISO 14001, A to E, and then imagine you're doing a little audit their policies to see if it complies with those requirements. Don't do it now, because you've not got time. And then if you work for a company or used to work for a company, you can do the same for your company. You can check to see if your policy is. So basically there's different types of policies. Some policies are really good, very strong, good commitments to, for example, complying with legal obligations, commitment to prevent pollution, protect the environment, and a commitment to continual improvement. Other policies are very weak and woolly, and when you're reading them you can see the company didn't really want to commit itself to anything too specific. So that's why if you have ISO 14001, because it's an international standard, your policy's got to be quite a strong policy and include some really key commitments. Okay, so now we're going to move on to planning. It's in planning where we identify the environmental aspects, as we call them. You have to have a process for determining the aspects and impacts of the organisation and evaluating the significance. You have to take account of changes, such as new developments and products, and abnormal and emergency conditions. You also have to consider a life cycle perspective of your organisation, so that includes your suppliers and your product or service. So how do you do that? Well, this is a simple step-by-step process that I use if I'm asked to help a company to establish an environmental management system. First of all, establish the boundaries. What does your organisation actually do? What's its geographical scope? And what are its range of activities? So it might be, for example, that your organisation just distributes energy. You may also generate electricity. You might do exploration, oil exploration. You might have a terminal. So there may be a number of different specific processes. So identify what those boxes are. Then divide the organisation into manageable chunks. So take each activity in turn, such as drilling, reception, distribution, refining. For each chunk or activity, identify all of the aspects and impacts, all of the relevant environmental issues basically. Then gather data about each one. So it's all very well saying we produce a lot of waste, or hazardous waste, but how much hazardous waste do we produce? What type is it? Asbestos? Is it contaminated land? So gather the data on each issue. And then evaluate the significance, i.e. the risk of each issue. If it's not significant, just record it. If it is significant, record it and control it in some way. And when we move on to the control part, then we move on to do. Plan, do. And then monitor, and that's check. So essentially this one slide illustrates plan, do, check, and review. So it's breaking down that cycle into more detailed stages. So there's some terms and definitions that we need to understand. Aspects and impacts. The environmental aspect is defined as the interaction with the environment or the cause, and the impact is the change to the environment or the effect. So imagine that you've got a factory. If you draw an imaginary bubble around that factory, anything that breaches that bubble, things that go in, go up, come out or down, these are environmental aspects. They interact with the environment. Okay? And on your sheets you've got a tool to help you identify the environmental aspects and impacts. This is the tool that I've been using for the last 20 years. Every time I go into a company to identify the environmental issues, I use this model, and it is really very useful indeed. So you're basically considering things like utilities coming in, air emissions, waste, and spills. You have to remember to consider a life cycle perspective, so not just what happens in your part of the organisation, but also the supply chain, up and down the supply chain, and your contractors. So an example would be the activity is a vehicle fleet. Aspects associated with a vehicle fleet could be use of fuel, exhaust emissions, and the use of water for washing. And then each activity, each aspect, in turn can have an impact or several impacts on the environment. So in this example, exhaust fumes can have local and global impacts. So local air pollution from the nitrogen dioxide, and particulates, acid rain from the acidic gases like sulfur dioxide, and then a contribution to global warming through the carbon dioxide emissions. So let's look at some examples specific to pipelines. The activity is welding a pipe. The aspect would be fumes and production of swarf. The impacts could be effects on human health, waste to landfill, or possibly recycling the swarf. If the activity was digging a trench in the sea, one of the aspects could be disturbance of the bottom sediment and increasing turbidity, and the impact of that could be the effects on the negative effects on the marine invertebrates and fish populations. Okay, so it's a systematic process. First of all, identify all the issues, consider the impact on the environment, then determine the significance, then put control measures in place. Okay. So what I'd like you to do is, using the model in front of you, identify the environmental aspects for a photograph that I'm going to give you. It's a very simple exercise. But what you could do is, you can scale this up, but I want to give you a simple activity to start with. But you could use exactly the same process for a whole oil refinery. So if you stay in the same teams, please. Okay, so one. Yeah, so the activity is cleaning the vehicles in the depot. Okay, and what I want you to do is, you have to work quite quickly on this. I'm just going to give you 6 minutes. Okay, 6 minutes. I want you to try to identify 10 environmental aspects. Okay?
This is uncontrolled discharge. Uncontrolled discharge.
Well, maybe the animals, but maybe this water gets in the eye and then absorb.
Yeah, you've got a few. Okay, I don't want you to labour this because there's another part to this exercise. Just have a, just an initial ideas is absolutely fine. Okay, so you've identified a range of environmental aspects associated with the activity. So just remember, you've done this for a very simple activity, washing a vehicle, but it could be a more complicated activity, like digging a trench to lay a pipeline. Okay. My advice to you is always to split it down into sections, because if you look at the whole company, it's overwhelming. It's much easier if you just... Somebody said to me, this phrase, the best way to eat an elephant is one chunk at a time. Which I think is a horrible expression, being obviously an environmentalist. No, I'm not. But I've never eaten an elephant. I can assure you. Please, trust me on that one. Okay. So, before we move on to the second stage, we've identified the issues, but now we need to move on to think about the significance, the risk. But before we can think about the risk, we need to gather data. And this is all about monitoring and measurement. So, for each topic, for utilities, we need to look at our electricity meter, our gas consumption, how much do we use, look at our invoices, how much is it costing us, raw materials, how much are we having to buy, look at the purchasing, atmospheric emissions, you talked about flaring, how much are we flaring, what's the, not oxides of nitrogen, oxides of sulfur, carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, particulate emissions, how many spills are we having? Can we monitor that? Number, volume. What's the loss rate? Okay. You might want to normalise the data. So look at the total leakage, but also look at the leakage per kilometre. Planned liquid discharges. In an oil refinery, you'll have certain planned discharges to water. For example, cooling water, trade effluent. What's the level of pollution in those? And you will probably have a permit which says you're allowed to discharge up to 100 parts per million suspended solids and so on. So can you measure that? Solid waste, how much waste do you produce? And get the waste data from the management companies. How many complaints have you had? How many prosecutions have you had? You get the idea. So gather lots of information. Once you've gathered the information, think about the risk. And there's three methods of evaluating environmental risk. The first method is a very simple method. Ask questions. Is the aspect having an impact on the environment? i.e., is it causing pollution? 2, legislation. Is it likely to break the law? This will vary from country to country. So find out what the law is. Is the issue likely to breach that? Thirdly, how sensitive is it to communities and stakeholders? So there's a range of stakeholders. Obviously, local communities are vitally important because they're the ones that are most directly affected by the company's activities. But there are other stakeholders as well, like shareholders, staff, stakeholders, and then cost. The government, regulators, various things. And the cost. Is it very inefficient? Is it a high cost? The second method is your classic health and safety risk assessment method, where you, on the one side, you have the likelihood, the risk of a problem occurring, and on this graph you have the severity. So you're trying to identify things in the top right-hand corner, environmental problems. If they did occur, it would be an absolute catastrophe. It would kill lots of fish or pollute lots of soil or environment, and it's likely to occur. So you can do a very straightforward risk ranking system, and then once you've risk assessed your aspects, you can then use the higher risk ones to identify potential improvements. And the third methodology, which isn't a completely separate methodology, but it's a way of thinking about environmental pollution, is source pathway perception. This is quite a powerful model. So the source could be the emissions from the power station, the pathway would be the air, but the pathway is very dependent upon what we call the prevailing winds. So you'll find in the UK, the expensive parts of town are to the west, and the cheaper parts of town, where the poorer people live, are to the east. And this is because in the Industrial Revolution, in the 17 and 1800s, the smoke from all the factories and the mills was generally in the centre of the towns, so it was blowing to the east. So all the workers and the poor people lived to the east. And still today, if you look carefully at London, Manchester, you can see the cheaper parts of town to the east and the parts and the more expensive parts of town to the west. Okay, so that's because of the prevailing winds from the west, and then the receptor, where the people live. This is very important for oil leaks. Source pathway receptor, especially very relevant for you as pipeline engineers, because if the source is the leak of a pipe, the first problem you've got is where is the leak? Because the pipe's very long. So all the way along your route of your pipe, you want to be thinking, are there any sensitive receptors along that route, like a river, a fishery, a farm? But what about the pathway? Because the pathway will be affected by the soil type. If the soil is clay, you're very lucky, because if there's a leak, it will just be impermeable to the oil, and you'll be able to see the oil when you arrive. But if the soil is sand, it will drain into the soil, and then it's more likely to flow into the drinking water or into the river. So source pathway receptor model. And then finally, we think about the control measures. So if we decide that we have got a significant environmental aspect based upon some kind of scoring system or question and answer system, we think about controls. And a very simple, there's different ways of thinking about controls. Operational controls, mechanical, technology, strategic, and human is one way. An even simpler technique is ERIC. Does anybody know what the E stands for? This is the best thing to do with any environmental problem or health and safety problem. So what's the best thing to do with a problem beginning with E? Sorry? Eliminate. Yeah, 10 points. Eliminate. Yeah, eliminate. And then the R? Reduce. Yeah, 10 points. The I? So, think of a chemical that you don't want to be exposed to. What would you use?
Isolate.
10 points. Yeah, isolate. The C is control. Control with some kind of basic, switch it on, switch it off. So, Eric, eliminate, reduce, isolate, control. So, take an oil leak. Can we eliminate it? Well, yeah, maybe we can. I showed you a transformer that was full of oil, but there are alternatives. You can have transformers that are solid state transformers that don't have oil in, but they have sort of maybe a resin. So we could potentially eliminate it. If we can't, if we need the oil, can we reduce it? Could we reduce the volume of the oil in the transformer? Could we have a more efficient transformer? If we rate the transformer to the right rating of a smaller transformer. Isolate. Do you remember the concrete bund wall in the first photograph? Yeah. Okay, still got the oil, but we've formed a barrier, we've isolated it. If we can't do any of those, controls are where we have to rely upon people to remember to do things like physically inspect the site every week to look for a leak. So you can use ERIC as a very simple thing to help you to reduce health and safety and environmental risk in your work. Okay, so second part of the exercise then is I'd like you to just 5 minutes again until 10 to. The 3 of the 8 last impacts that you've identified, describe them in the table below and identify control measures. Okay. So I'm just going to help remind you on the definition of the aspects and the impacts, because you need to write them out. So so the aspects would be things like exhaust fumes, and the impacts would be the change to the environment. So if you pick 3 of your aspects that you identified in the previous exercise, 1, 2, 3, write out the aspect, write out the impact, think about the risk level, is it high, medium or low, you can just do it very simply, and then think about the control measures that the company could apply to reduce the environmental risk. Okay, go.
I went a bit fast.
Where we get risk level? Matrix, risk matrix.
You can just keep it very simple, like high, medium,
Ugly. The usage. It was environmental. How about generating fuel? Exhaust fuel. No, it's not the generator, not the vehicle. Because you need to run the pump and the operation, you need the generator. Or pump is the way to say that. Something like you could check all the animals. Yeah, well, I was
Yeah, all this. Let's try to
Use the washing bathing as well. Well, as most of the you don't have enough water. Water, not the sanitary. Yeah, they're not that much water available.
Completely.
Okay, I appreciate you're probably not all finished, but time is marching on. So we're going to just do some quick feedback from this exercise. So did anybody have an aspect in relation to water runoff? Okay. Water runoff? Yeah, at the back. Do you want to just tell us about what you found for water runoff?
Contaminated water, environmental aspect, and inspections, water pollution.
Yeah.
So for us it's high risk. And we just put the suggestion for the area isolation, some boundaries or drain system.
Good. Okay. And did anybody else get anything additional for control measures for that one? Drainage? Anything else to do with
Recycling.
Sorry?
cleaning and recycling water.
Cleaning?
Recycling water.
Oh, recycling. Yeah, perhaps have a closed loop. That's a really good idea. That sometimes you can reuse slightly dirty water several times, or you can filter it and then reuse it. So that's an example of the circular economy in action. The really important thing with the runoff is that it doesn't go into the surface water drain, so that it should go into the foul drain, which goes to the sewage treatment works, not to the river. So some companies colour code the drains on their site, red for dirty drains and blue for surface water drains. Any trade effluent, such as vehicle washing, should go into the dirty drain, not the clean drain. Did anybody have anything for waste or resource use? What was the order? Dirt, debris. Do you want to tell us about that one?
Yeah, that's the aspect.
Dirt. Yeah. Okay.
Impact is contaminated land,
Contaminated land.
green space,
Yeah.
risk level medium, and we use an effective washing for proper collection and disposal.
Yeah. So to get rid of the sediment. Yeah. Good. Do you want to give us one of yours at the back?
Was noise.
Noise. Yeah.
Ground
Yeah.
groundwater.
Okay. What control measures did you have for noise?
Isolated somewhere. Build it somewhere there is not many people.
Yeah. Okay. I don't know if you noticed, but it's actually the jet wash is powered by a little generator in the hut. You can see the chimney. Yeah. So it might be quite noisy. And obviously the impact depends upon the context, how close people are. This team, did you have anything else that we've not discussed yet?
No, it was still the same, but
Yeah.
it's only that we thought about the generator by installing a canopy as a control mechanism.
Installing a
A canopy,
canopy
for noise
for
control.
noise control. In terms of noise, let's say you had an operation that was causing a lot of noise. A generator. Think about Eric, the E. What would the eliminate involve?
Maybe more sophisticated equipment.
Silencer.
Electric.
That's reduce electric, yeah. So very often in construction, if noise is a problem, if you can plan ahead and get a mains connection, then you can eliminate the need for a generator. So just I've got a couple more slides, and then we're nearly there. Don't panic. Okay. So we talked about context, we talked about leadership, and we talked about planning. And at the final end of this exercise, we moved on to control measures using ERIC. The control measures relate to 7 supports, like provision of infrastructure and resources, 8 operation, engineering controls, people controls, procedures. We talked a bit about performance evaluation, like the key performance indicators that we might use to measure success, and then finally improve. Okay, so what I've given you is an overview of an environmental management system. I just need to finish by explaining that there are some potential pitfalls. It's not all necessarily perfect. Once you've identified a risk, you're probably under a greater moral obligation to manage that risk. There is a commitment to maintaining the environmental management system because you've got to train staff and you've got to pay for the audit company to come in, so there's a cost to it. It may increase some workload on certain staff because they're going to have additional duties like segregating waste, cleaning up spillages, so it might take time. There's going to be a need to ensure that all staff know their responsibilities and they are competent. Okay? So, as well as all the benefits, there are some potential downsides, mainly to do with time and cost. But as Sue said at the end, that lots of stakeholders and supply chain pressure now to have an environmental management system. Okay, so that's the overview. Hopefully that lecture gives you all the information you need to answer any exam questions on EMS. The slides are on Blackboard. Could I ask you to leave the photographs, please, because I need them for my next lecture. Can you take the handouts? But thank you very much. I wish you all the best in your fine careers.
Yeah, and then stuff onto you.
So,